Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with very special guest, Jonathan Su. Jonathan's the co-founder of Tribe. We previously had Arjun Sethi, his other co-founder, on last year. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So Jonathan, you're the co-founder of Tribe. Before that, you spent a few years at Social Capital. I think you started there in 2014.
Yeah.
Before that, background in Facebook, background in games, PhD in physics. Maybe let's start with, you entered venture in 2014 with a specific data background. Where have you been surprised, or where has it been interesting to see where your background has been able to make an impact and where your background maybe hasn't, in the sense of venture isn't ready to be changed in that direction? Because, a few years ago, there was this idea that software was going to change, data was going to change venture in every aspect: sourcing, selecting, supporting. And I think we've seen some areas where data and software has been able to make some impact, and some areas where maybe it's more artisan and more crafty, more of a craft than we thought. It's still an ongoing debate. So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. I think, it's an interesting question. I think the way to think about this is really to go back and think about how is it that data has affected companies more broadly. I think this is what we were dealing with at Facebook. So at Facebook, I joined Facebook in 2009. I was there till 2014 and really helped to bring together the data science and analytics organization. When people think about data science and analytics at Facebook, at least, certainly back then, certainly today to some degree, the first thing that comes to people's minds is that, they use data to build algorithms, right? They build the news feed, or they use data to, build ad targeting or something like that. And that's definitely a huge use of the data. But there's this other story, this other side to it, which is that they use data to help them make better decisions, right? At Facebook, at this point, I think there's about 1,500, 2,000 data science and analytics, folks there, and they're not building these algorithms that we're talking about. What they're doing is they're leveraging all this data really mostly to make the vast majority of it to build better products, right? Like, can we use the data to help us understand what does it mean to build this product marginally better, or what does it mean to, how are folks over there in this part of the world using it on these devices, and how do we just make the product better? And so data to influence the execution and operations, the product development, that's really what we oversaw at Facebook. And that story is not told, I think, as often, because it's not as obvious from the outside, right? And it's sort of the same thing in venture. When I joined Social Capital in 2014, really the initial focus was really working with portfolio companies. The idea is, portfolio Series A companies, and early stage companies, when a company is sort of around that Series A, they have maybe 10 employees and they have some data, but it's not the highest priority of that for them to dig through it and uncover all the insights. It doesn't make sense for that to be their top priority, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable and worth doing. And so that was a lot of the work that we did early on was, can we work with portfolio companies to help the data tell stories for them, to help make the data useful for them? Very much an extension of what we did at Facebook. When we talk about 2,000 data scientists, that's what they do. And so the question is, could we do that in portfolio companies, very much in the context of helping the companies grow, helping the companies, today we would call it help them expand product market fit. But back then it was really grow. It was the idea of growth. And that sort of formed sort of the backbone of the initial time that I spent in venture, and has ended up being broadly sort of I think the area where we've really focused on, more broadly, this question of how is it that we understand growth? How is it that we understand product market fit? And then how is data science and analytics relevant for that? I think there are many different ways you can use data science or analytics in venture, right? When you think about venture, there's sourcing, there's evaluating, there's managing, and data science certainly has something to say about each of those aspects. But really starting on that last aspect, helping the companies after you've invested in them, that's really where we found the most value. And I think that goes back to the sense that, what is it we're trying to do as investors? You're trying to be great partners for entrepreneurs. Well, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to grow. So, if you can help them do that in a way that's not getting all in their face, in a way that's helpful, if you can be a good partner, then clearly that's got to be valuable. And so that's really the thing that we've spent the vast bulk of our time exploring. That's what I've been spending my time exploring, in venture capital ever since I started. And
I'm curious why you found the most traction, supporting post-investment. I see why you found a lot of traction there. I'm curious, is it less obvious how, your skill set, or even just data and software in general, can meaningfully influence the selection process? or the sourcing process, or how do you think about those?
Yeah, it definitely affects the other two. I would say as a byproduct, stepping over to the sourcing side. So sourcing, we definitely do some data stuff in sourcing, but by far the most valuable thing we do is we try to give good, useful analytical feedback to companies that we meet with, whether we invest in them or not. And, by and large, companies have a great experience with us, sharing data with us, talking through metrics, talking through how product strategy turns into numbers. And that activity adds value no matter what. Yeah. And then hopefully that drives good vibes and it gets them to send us people. It gets their other seed investors to think, about us a little differently than other Series A investors. And that drives deal flow. And that inbound deal flow is going to be far more powerful than any algorithm that I can cook up based on some data sets, right? Yeah. Because, when you think about doing some sort of algorithmic sourcing, you kind of face this problem. If you let's say you're running a good company, you're a seed stage company, you're doing great. And somebody comes up to you and says, hey, my algorithm says we should talk. Your natural inclination is like, okay, well, I have all these other investors who've been spending time trying to help me. Yeah. Like, well, who are you? Right? So the thing is sourcing. So that's kind of what we found was that, sourcing for us, it's a much more personal thing. There's a natural constraint in venture, which I think is that. And that's really the place where we've been focusing. And then on evaluation, obviously, like if you believe that you can understand how growth and product market fit, if you can understand the nuances there, if you believe you can understand it at an earlier stage better than others, then yeah, maybe it'll help you, be a better picker. And certainly we believe that. But really the focus is on helping companies. That's always the first thing. And then this other stuff is sort of, we believe is a great byproduct.
Right. And is picking just so much more of an art than a science?
Well, I think, we would say that there's a very scientific art aspect to it. And then there are parts of it that are art. The analogy I like to say that accountants were the first data scientists. This is a bit of an absurd thing to say. So what does that mean? So what does an accountant do? An accountant takes a pile of raw data, the ledger, right? Every transaction, and they turn it into something useful, like an income statement or a balance sheet. That's really all data scientists do, right? We take a big pile of raw data. It's important that it's raw. That's only data scientists really deal with raw data. We start with a big pile of raw data and turn it into something useful. Maybe we do a bunch of fancy whizzy math, like, we can do lots of math, but in the end of the day, if you're a strategic decision maker, CEO or an investor or whatever, you're trying to make a big decision, you don't care about fancy math. You care about, can I trust this? Is it useful? Right. And so that's really, that's really where we've focused our time. When we think about data, that's the first bit. It's more accounting like, I have this saying that like, Warren Buffett, do you think he looks at income statements? Well, yes. Right. Would he ever invest based only on an income statement? No, that would be foolish, right? Would he pass based on an income statement alone? Yes, right? And that's a great example of data being used in an investment context, right? It's not AI, it's not machine learning, but Warren Buffett uses income statements. That is a great use of data that is in line with the thing I said before about how companies use data to improve their operations, to improve their execution, and is in line with how we think broadly about using data science and analytics in the evaluation process in the early stage venture.
And so would that imply on the source side, for example, that capital as a service is not something you guys are building at Tribe? Or I assume, what are the lessons from that experiment?
Well, at Social Capital, we built a bunch of different things that tried to use data in different ways. One of the ways that we tried to use it was, to use these approaches to understand product market fit at the early stage and automatically invest in them. If you think about it, it's not so crazy because if you think about like debt underwriting, right? Yeah. If I need a home loan, like a mortgage, I go in and the bank effectively does an algorithmic underwriting. Yes, they use humans to do it, but they're basically following a rule book, and the rule book tells them when to invest, i.e. underwrite debt, and when not to. So it's not super crazy. I think the idea behind capital as a service. Now, it turns out that there are a bunch of difficulties there because, buying debt secured by a house is very different from buying equity in an early stage company. Those are just totally different assets. And it turns out that, it's not so obvious how to extend one into the other. So, we explore that at Social Capital. It's not something that we are currently exploring at Tribe, not something we're aiming to explore, but, I definitely think it was something that was audacious in its own way. And honestly, there's many other things like that broadly, right? I mean, financial services broadly, one of the things that's going on in the last 5-10 years is there's just many different ways to underwrite debt, equity, income sharing agreements with education, right? There's many different ways to sort of, quote unquote, underwrite an investment, whether the investment is debt or equity. And I think capital as a service was one of those attempts. I think of it in that context.
I do want to transition to some of the company building stuff, but first I want to make sure we cover the extent to which you and your team and broader social team as well and tribe team as well have really innovated within venture, because there aren't that many people who are launching different kinds of data products to take a stab. And some things work and some things don't, and some things, little parts of them work. So I'm curious at Social if you can sort of run through whatever experiments your team or broadly experimented with. There was CAS, which you talked about, capital as a service. There was 8Ball. What are the
Well, when we think about 8Ball, you see, so it's sort of a moniker that we came up with at Social Capital, but it's honestly not. So there's, on the one hand, the way I described it, there's something that looks kind of like accounting. And so the question here is like, how do you understand product market fit the way that accounting understands sort of the cash and financial position of a company, right? If you think about what accounting does, accounting is kind of neat because what it does is it takes the history of a company and it takes that ledger and it turns it into a bunch of variables that are kind of like well understood, right? Here's an income statement. The income statement doesn't predict the future. What it does is it helps parameterize the past in a bunch of variables that you and I can talk about sensibly and in a bunch of variables that I don't have to reinvent for every new company. It's like, insurance company, I don't have to reinvent accounting. Accounting, like the core high level concepts of accounting continue to apply. And then in any one sector, you kind of have to get specific about it, right? And so when we think about product market fit, it's a similar thing. We have this framework for understanding early stage product market fit that works kind of like accounting in the sense that it's a bunch of well-defined variables so that we can look at different companies and understand what's going on and just have a sensible conversation. And that framework, we called it the 8Ball at Social Capital, and we continue to do so today. There's sort of the framework aspect of it. It's a framework for helping you understand the past. But then there's this other question of, if you go back to financial statements for a moment, if someone does an audit on you, they do your financial statements for you and they give it back to you, right? That's like a product that you give. And so we also, use the term 8Ball to refer to the thing that we give back to founders. It's like the analysis that we do for you. And then, you could imagine other things. You could imagine building software that does it. And you could imagine putting the software on the internet and, like QuickBooks Online for finance, right? Yeah. And there are many different versions of it, but at its very base, it's sort of a conceptual way of understanding product market fit in terms of a bunch of analytical quantitative variables that are reasonable to compute given today's products, given today's technology. I should note that like when I talk about these analytical frameworks, people, many people have come up with similar things. They were all invented in the mid 2000s, really. What happened was, in the social web era, all of a sudden you had these companies that were all of a sudden able to store a ton of data. Facebook was one of them, Zynga, all those social gaming companies. And every one of them is like, we have this big giant pile of data. What can I use this for? Well, the most important thing is to grow. So let's use the data to try to grow. And each one try to reinvent some framework for understanding how to grow and how to use the data to their advantage. And, as we know now, right, the social gaming companies, a lot of them were really able to use it to their advantage, some for better, some for worse. But it was really, that was really the era in which this began because it was the first time you could store the data. People running Pepsi 40 years ago would have loved to do this, I'm sure. But the ability, do you think Pepsi in 1980 would have been able to say, okay, what is the 85th percentile of cumulative cans of Pepsi drunk after, 24 months of the first Pepsi? They would never have been able to compute such a thing because they never had the data. So, because we have this data available to us now, we have this opportunity at this point in history to be able to take that data and think about it in this way.
And why was it the mid 2000s and not the 90s with Amazon or
well, the technology needed to happen, right? In the mid 2000s is when the storage got cheap, right? Specifically at Facebook, where we had this giant, distributed file system and you could build tools on top of it that would make it easy for analysts to do stuff on it. That didn't exist the decade before, right? The storage had to get cheap and the technology had to get to the point where you could literally hire a bunch of folks who basically have MBAs and have them actually be useful on it. Whereas if you look in the mid 90s, mid 80s, if you handed a raw relational database to an MBA and asked them to do stuff, that you'd be hard pressed because the technology made it very difficult.
Could there be another technological shift that mirrored the one in the mid 2000s that makes in the next decade or so or two that makes another sort of compound effect of data being available?
Yeah. I think about this a lot, actually, because as you can imagine, I see a lot of companies that try to build analytics products or BI products, something. Actually, a lot of folks say to me, they say, oh, I read your articles. I turned it into a product. Here it is. And I'm like, that's cool. But the thing is, when I think about it, it goes back to accounting, right? If you think about the value of accounting, in the world, does the value of accounting mostly, sit inside companies that implement software for it, like QuickBooks or something? Or is most of the value actually in Excel, right? It's actually in Excel. There's this thing I like to say to, young data scientists. I point out to them like linear regression. Let's take linear regression. If you go back 100 years, right, and you say 100 years ago, how many times did linear regression happen in the world? The answer is not that much, because if you wanted to do linear regression, what would you have to do? You have to hire a statistician who would have to get a piece of paper and a pencil, and they would have to write down a bunch of stuff. They'd have to do this really horrible math by hand, right? Maybe 120 years ago, in order to do linear regression. Nowadays, how often does linear regression happen? Well, every second it happens on like a bazillion computers, right? Your computer's just doing linear regression. You don't even know it to do random things, right? To give you an example of where it happens a lot, it mostly happens in Excel. Right? It's like bankers or insurance analysts doing some linear regression, and they just kind of do it in Excel. And so that's where most of it happens, right? And so the lesson there is that something that was once very hard to do is all of a sudden very easy to do. And when you make it easy to do it, everybody just kind of does it, and they kind of do it wrong. We can imagine bankers probably do linear regression wrong. I mean, this is a physicist in me talking, but like, who cares? They get value out of it, right? And so when I think about like, all the stuff that's happened in the last sort of 10 years around machine learning and AI, and it's all very impressive, but the natural end state of that stuff is likely inside something that looks like an Excel, right? It's not going to realize its full potential unless we're in a position where everybody can use it. And I literally mean everybody. Nobody needs computer science degrees. Nobody needs to be super intense, right? So I think that's kind of, that's an important thing to think about. It's like, how are these algorithmic data methodologies going to be democratized in some sense, right? What is going to be the quote unquote Excel, what Excel did for linear regression? What's it going to be for this other stuff?
Yeah. And so, any ideas?
I don't. I mean, we see a lot of, we see companies that do stuff. And I think that, honestly, I don't think there'll be one answer, right? Excel was a bit of a sort of artifact of history. The fact that Excel is at once the power tool for the banker, but is also the power tool for the insurance guy, and is the power tool for the performance marketing analyst at a company. That's remarkable that there's one tool that does that. And I think that's partially an artifact of the past, right? The likely case in the future is that there are tools that are a bit more vertical specific, right? It's like, the next wave of technology will probably be more like something that works for the banker, and then there'll be something special for the insurance analyst. And that's not so unreasonable, because, their use cases, they're pretty different. And using, as we all know, all of us who've done a lot of Excel, it's kind of kludgy to try to force Excel to do all this stuff. And, I remember sitting next to, my friends who have finance backgrounds, and watching them sit at Excel. They just do all this crazy stuff. And it reminds me of sitting next to a great software engineer. Like, I wrote a lot of code, but I was never very, very good at it. And sitting next to a great software engineer, and they're just busting out all this stuff. And I'm like, whoa. And the thing is, those two behaviors are actually very similar. I think that the software engineers in us, we like to sort of think, we're somehow the Excel stuff is beneath us, but it's not, right? Both of you are trying to like use technology to create some representation of the world, a quote unquote model of some sort, whether the model be in some object oriented software or the model is a financial model of some sort. You're both trying to build a model, and you have some technology that you're fluent in, right? So I mean, it's an interesting thing. I don't know.
I want to get to product market fit and company building, but just to close the loop, are there any other tools or products that, whether it's Social Capital or Tribe, were interesting experiments worth mentioning in Venture? If not, no pressure, we could skip to some other stuff.
I think that was the biggest one. This has always been the area that we focused on, is really product market fit. I think other areas that we've thought about data, people ask us this all the time. They say, how do you use data to measure talent? Because talent is so important. And I agree, talent is so important. And so I frame it this way. Okay, so if you think about, what is it that data does for you? Well, what data does is it helps you control bias, right? You look at a situation, before you have data, you're like, I think X, Y, Z is true. And then you have data, and it's like, oh, X was true, Y and Z not so true, right? And, it just helps you sort of verify. And how is it, that data helps in talent? Where are the best examples of that? I would submit that I believe the best examples of that are things like college applications. Now, this is kind of crazy, right? If you were to say to somebody, I believe college applications is a wonderful data-driven thing, they'd say, oh my God, you're so wrong. College applicants is this hugely biased system, only, benefits the rich and so on and so forth. But I mean, that might be true now, but if you think about it relative to like 100 years ago, that's definitely not the case, right? It's certainly the case today that when you apply to college, you give them a bunch of data, your GPA, your transcript, your standardized test scores. They've tried to turn you into a bunch of numbers, right? And then they certainly use some discretion at the end, I'm sure, But if you think about college application as a whole, not for any one school, because of course any one school is going to get it right and wrong sometimes. But if you think about the overall system of, we generate all these 18-year-olds who go to college, that whole system is a fairly data-driven way of attempting to assess talent. That's what it is. And it's far more data-driven now than it was 100 years ago, right? And, when I think about like data and talent, I think about that a lot. It's like, well, there are good things about that. There are bad things about that, right? There are clearly good things in that it helps you control bias. There are clearly bad things because it's going to help you, reinforce stereotypes or reinforce possibly some injustice that exists before. But that's true. But that does, you don't want that to stop you from trying, right? Yeah. From trying to implement it in some way. I don't have a good solution here, but this is something we've thought about a lot. Another area where this actually happens is in terms of hiring in the large tech companies. If you go into a company like Facebook or Google and you look at how they hire technical talent, actually all talent, they have a bunch of mechanisms in place to help them reduce bias, right? They give their feedback on the interview blind, right? Like it's like you interview someone, you write your feedback in blind, nobody else, before reading anybody else's feedback, right? As opposed to, I read everybody else's feedback, everybody tells me what they think about the candidate, then I meet the candidate. Hugely biasing, right? So these tech companies have done a bunch of stuff to try to debias the situation as best as possible. Apparently I've heard that at Facebook, when they write interview feedback, they're not allowed to use gender pronouns. All the feedback is ungendered just to remove that bias. And so, there are these practices that these companies have done to try to debias and try to make their hiring, more data-driven maybe, but really more bias-controlled, right? And then if you think about sort of legacy companies, do you think that Geico Insurance hires that way? Almost certainly not. So that's another angle that I've been thinking about. Is like, well, are there ways that we can use some of those, philosophies to sort of, debias how we think about assessing talent? But for us, because part of where we invest, we think so much about product market fit. This is always, step two for us a little bit, but and a very important step two for us. But the product market fit for us has always been sort of the P1.
It's interesting on the talent side. It's interesting because we just had Tyler Cowan on the podcast, and he's now writing a book on talent and evaluating talent, assessing talent, and he is surprised, maybe even shocked, I don't speak for him, at how unrigorous venture capitalists are. He thought they would be the pinnacles of talent evaluation, and how much of it really is just gut. Is there?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, if you think back to going back to like mortgage underwriting, right? If you look at like mortgage underwriting in the like early part of the 20th century, it's like, if you needed to mortgage, how do you think you did it? Well, you would go to the bank in the corner and you'd be like, oh, my wife, does lawn bowling with your wife. You and I, we both went to Harvard. You should write me a loan. And they would just do it, right? Yeah. Totally by gut. And what's happened in the last 100 years? Now, of course, that's not the case. There's all this data involved. And it's a combination of two things, right? On the one hand, there's like regulation that comes in and says you have to do it this way to be fair. But on the other hand, it's also in the business interest of the banks, right? It's in the business interest of the capital allocators at some level to use data to try to get better at it. And I think it's the same thing, in venture. There's huge swaths of it that just involve enormous amounts of discretion and gut. Yeah. And I think part of what we do at Tribe is, we really try not to get rid of that, because there's a lot of stuff that's really important in that. Yeah. The intuition, the traditional component of venture, but it doesn't mean that there's no space to add something objective, right? And the question is, how can you do both of these at once? Are there other systems in the world that try to mix both of these activities at once and get somewhere successful? And when I think about the operations of these internal companies using data, or when I think about the system of, college admissions or these other systems, they're good examples of systems that do a decent job, or at least they're systems that you can learn from, right.
But is it fair to say that we're more at like the checklist manifesto stage of making sure that people are just running a good process and being consistent every time, versus being at the sort of like, hypothetical sort of matter mark for founders, or i.e. you grew up in Atlanta and you're more likely to, these parameters about your life make you more likely to be successful. And that's its own version of bias, but is that fair to say we're more at, making the level on the talent level when we're thinking about investing in founders or thinking about even hiring people, just making sure we're running a good process versus truly using data inputs about their life?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, the big thing that's happened is just that there's been an explosion of investors, right? If there are only 5 investors, then it's like, well, let's hope that they're doing the right and just thing for society at large, or maybe we can regulate them to do it. But, one of the things that's happened in early stage venture is that there's just now an explosion of firms, which means that for any possible, philosophical approach or investment philosophy or process that you can dream up, there probably exists a firm that does it, right? And that's good for entrepreneurs, right? Because from an entrepreneur's point of view, it's like, well, now instead of talking to just the 5 guys on Sandhill, there's like hundreds of investors I can theoretically talk to. I can find one that fits with me. And so, when you ask me like, where are we stage-wise? Well, I think there are investors who are really into checklists. I think checklists are great. There are certainly investors out there who really try to make it a black box, a quant machine. There are rumors about what Google Ventures does internally with some sort of box that has a green and red light on it. Who knows? I don't really know. And then but the thing is, like, I would never think of any one of these as like a statement about where venture is going. I think each one of them is a statement that because venture is growing by so much, anything is possible, including these things. Yeah. And I think that's true of us at Tribe also. We would not claim that we are where the future is. We would claim that we're one of many and that we have an approach that we think works for us. Yeah. And we hope that if other people find it valuable, we hope that they will come to us or share deals with us. And that's our hope. We don't have any claim of being like the only one.
Right. But how would you close the loop on this topic? How would you crystallize what makes Tribe different versus Benchmark or Greylock or traditional, top firms in terms of how you view the business differently? And 10 years from now, if we're talking about the future of venture, maybe I'll rephrase it to ask, what do you think about when you think about the future of venture? How are firms going to look different in 10 years? Or Keith Boy would say, it's going to look the same, basically.
Yeah, it'll just keep growing, I think. And as it grows, there'll be firms of every flavor, really every flavor, right? There'll be some firm that just does data-driven sourcing, but completely discretionary evaluation only in fintech, only in Atlanta. There will be a firm like that one day, right? In physics, you call these systems ergodic. Yeah. Ergodic systems are ones that explore every possible configuration. Yeah. It's kind of like if you have a room and you throw a ball into the room and it bounces around forever. At some point, it touches every point in the room, right? And I think that's actually what happens. When I think about what we focus on product market fit, growth, right? And we want to help you grow. We want to be your partners. We want to be great partners if it matters to you to grow and you want a partner who understands that and who's going to be a partner with you for that. What that partially means is that there are other areas where we don't think we're amazing. Talent is a great example. There are other firms who are like, we will find you the best VP of sales. We're like, yeah, we'll help you, but we don't claim to be the greatest at this. We claim to be okay at it, and I think that's, firms are going to specialize where they specialize, and that's great, and if you were to ask me to forecast in the future, I think it'll be more of that in the sense of just more versions of the thing, right?
Yeah. Was the term ergodic?
Ergodic.
Yes. Ergodicity, maybe?
Ergodicity is our systems that are ergodic.
Yeah. I keep hearing that term. I don't know if it's used in the concept of like almost anti-fragile or.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a similar thing, right? It's like, because the system itself, right. If you think about venture capital at a system level, right? Would we be better off, right? Having all this venture capital flowing through 5 firms, or would we be better off having it flow through 5,000? At a system level, we're better off with 5,000, right? Because that means if any one of them fails or is turning out to be doing something evil or horrible or loses money, then like it doesn't destroy the whole thing. Whereas if there are only 5 of them, then all sorts of awful things happen, right? You don't want like choke points in the system. You want the system to be like highly distributed, right? And that's sort of where you seem to get the best outcomes. That's kind of, I think an approximate takeaway for some of this stuff from Taleb's work.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have this question I've been asking. I haven't heard any good perspectives on it. Maybe your physics background can lend some insight into it, which is basically the evolution between decentralization and centralization. And the way I ask it is, in 10 years from now, are we more likely to have one language or thousands of languages? One currency or thousands of currencies? This may be 100 years from now, hundreds of years, one country or thousands of countries. Like, is there likely to be consolidation or deconsolidation? And I get that the answer is some versions of both and there are phases, but what are the dynamics that cause there to be more consolidation or deconsolidation, and how can we think about predicting?
Yeah. Well, I think that I'm generally of the belief that markets and economies left on their own, right? There are aspects of them that tend towards, right, decentralization. And then there are aspects of them that tend towards monopoly, right? For instance, the tendency towards fragmentation is the tendency for people who want to start businesses. The fact that you want to start a business is itself a manifestation of the tendency for the system to fragment, right? But then at the same time, we know that there are dynamics that, accrue sort of power to the firms or entities that are already powerful. So I think both happen to some degree, right? And the thing that sort of intervenes itself, of course, is politics, right? Because, a political body can come in and sort of, manipulate the system in one direction or the other. Certainly history would seem to suggest that there's sort of a ebb and flow here. There's not sort of like one end state, right? I mean, like on the one hand, you could say China is a great example of like fully central sort of, monopoly power, if you look at it through the lens of sort of the government. But at the same time, we also know there's this massive, thriving capitalist entrepreneurial community there that would suggest the opposite end. Yeah. Both of these things can be true at once, right? It's really sort of a reflection of our facile attempt to to label the thing when the thing is far too complicated for us to label.
Close loop on some of the talent stuff. If you were a head of Harvard admission, just entirely soup to nuts, what might you add or do differently or than what you perceive Harvard or Harvard-esque institutions doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I would be humble and try to learn what they've done, because I think that most of these systems, something like Harvard admissions or something like, I don't know, how Blackstone does an investment, these are probably like, they're processes that have been going on for a long time, and the improvements are likely on the edges. It's not like an overhaul, right? I think, American government's that way too, right? American government's structured to be like, to have a separation of powers, to be frustrated all the time. People are like, oh, why doesn't anything ever change? Well, it's designed to not change. The whole point of the system is to not change, right? And I think it's the same thing with something like this, right? It's like I would go in, humbly to see like, okay, what's going on? Where do you guys think the improvements are? I mean, this is one of the things with all of these systems that people like to poke at from afar, whether it be Harvard or whether it be the government or whether it be a company, the operations of some company. We like to sit from afar and like snipe at it. Oh, if I were running the place, I would do so much better. But you're not giving enough credit to the people who work at these companies. The people who work inside these companies are smart people. They're trying to do the right thing. And it's wrong for us to try to just demonize them, at every turn, because that's what the media wants us to do. The more correct thing to do is to appreciate that people are generally good, trying to do the right thing. And there's likely some stuff on the margins that needs to happen. Right. I think that's true for a lot of these companies.
One thing I'm interested in, just a broader level of evaluating talent, is reference checks are interesting. We have all this information in our heads about other people and how good we think they are and how, we've worked with many of them and how good they are. And, it's a very manual process to consistently get references. It's a repetitive process, and you only get, a very small fraction of the total available data that is on this person or what people think about them. I wonder if that information, if that will become a more efficient market over time, by becoming digital in a way.
Would you want it to be more efficient?
There's some dystopian elements to it, but if, hopefully we'd get, the positive side would be you'd get people a chance who are not getting a chance currently. And university is an interesting example because there's not a ton of data point. You haven't like worked jobs, but hey, I don't know if you've been in classes, you've had a lot of teachers, and how many references are they really doing on individual people? What do they see? They see your college essay, they see your report card, and they make a decision, right?
Of course, the fully dystopian version of this, right, is this like Chinese
Black Mirror.
In China, there's the like social score where they like theoretically like watch you with a bunch of cameras, and depending on your behavior, they may or may not underwrite a loan for you, which is the fully dystopian end of this story. I don't know. I think it's interesting if you think about in America, right? We have like credit bureaus, right? There are 3 of them, not one. There are 3, and I guess they all kind of come back with the same answer. But each bank kind of underwrites differently, and now there are a bunch of non-bank financial actors that will underwrite differently. It's like, it's reasonable for there to exist entities that try to collate this kind of feedback information, like credit bureaus, right? But it's also reasonable for people to do what they can to like get around them, right? Maybe another way to put it, it's reasonable that the government doesn't mandate that any of them be fully monopoly, right? The government kind of sits back and says, well, okay, they're credit bureaus or rating agencies or some such. You maybe should use them, but we're not going to super force it depending on the situation. And I think it's probably the same thing when it comes to talent, right? In some sense, there is one big standardized reference for talent. It's LinkedIn. Right? Go to LinkedIn and see exactly what's on your resume. But somehow we want more than that. The standard thing is not enough, right? And okay, now you want, it's like, if you go back to the statement I said about earlier about, you want data that gives you an output that is useful and that you can trust, right? Well, LinkedIn, I feel like you can trust it, right? You believe that it's mostly truthy, what people write on there. Is it useful? Yes and no. It's useful to for the first kind of view, but we all know, those of us who think about talent a lot, that it's never enough, right? And the reality is any machine that tried to give you the answer, you probably wouldn't trust it. Right? I mean, would you trust a machine to pick your wife for you? No. Nobody would do that. I have this saying that like, you should use data when you're making a large N of decisions. Like for instance, if I'm wondering what ad to show you when you're on Facebook, I should use an algorithm to do this. Why? Because I'm making so many thousands of decisions every second, algorithm's good. But if you're making a very low end decision, data is probably only marginally helpful. Low end decisions are, what college do I go to? Yeah. Who should I marry? Should I have a child or not? Right? And like, I think when you invest in an early stage company, like, for most of us who do, sort of, early stage investing, you don't make a ton of them. Maybe you make like, one a month tops. Maybe more, for us, it's like 2 a year, 3 a year. It's a very low end activity. And so it doesn't mean you don't use data. It just means you have to use data in the right way because of the nature of the decision making.
Totally. Yeah. And so let's get to product market fit. How do you define what product market fit is? And how do you sort of see it differently than perhaps it's typically demonstrated, or what mistakes or misconceptions do people typically have?
Yeah. So going back to the accounting analogy, we don't actually have a definition of product market fit. It's kind of like the concept of profitable. If you think about income statements, right? And then the concept of profitable actually doesn't really have a definition, because it's like, do you mean contribution margin profitable, gross margin, net margin, operating, EBIT? Yep. The definition of profitable that is appropriate depends on sort of the broader context of what you're trying to do, right? If you're like a buyout investor, you're going to think about one thing. If you're a venture guy, you're going to think about something else, right? Everybody kind of uses it differently depending on the situation. And similarly for us, when we think about product market fit, it actually depends on the situation. Similarly to those other definitions, for profit, we have like a lot of different ways of thinking about it that end up applying to different sectors, different business models, different stages of a company. And it's never black or white. And I think that's one of the important things is, you take the concept of product market fit from being this kind of binary gut thing, which is what most people treat it, and we turn it into this giant shades of gray thing that looks more like financial statements. We have to be willing to give up the black and white, but in exchange, we get a more nuanced view of the world.
Yeah. Would it be helpful to pick a sector or think about a few different sectors and how you look at key metrics differently within those sectors?
When we think about, a lot of this stuff was actually developed really, in the social web days and at Facebook. So at Facebook, it was kind of like, and in social web companies in general, it was like, okay, this concept of monthly active users. Yeah. Is it growing? Right? That's kind of one. There's this whole concept of growth accounting, which is, how is it growing? Is it growing because you're, there's different ways you can grow. And then there's this concept around cohorts, right? Can you measure cohort retention? And oftentimes it might be lifetime value, LTV, right? There are many sort of cohort level stuff. And then, in social web world, we used to think about this concept of like how often you use it, how intensely you use the product, right? Yeah. They called it L28 back then. It was like, how many days in the last 28 were you active? If you're, you could be a monthly active user, but if you're only active 1 day in the month, that's very different from if you're active 28 days out of the month, right? And how do you get a feel for that gradation? And sort of those were kind of three of the pillars that ended up, from my point of view anyway, being very common, no matter who came up with it. Whether the folks at Twitter, the folks at Facebook, the folks at Zynga, we all came up with roughly similar things, and these three were pretty common. And so for us, those three sort of formed the base set of things to look at. And, I wrote a bunch of articles about this topic. And I think one of the important things is that these frameworks, they work whether or not the value that's moving around has anything to do with dollars, right? A lot of these frameworks, as I mentioned, were developed in the context of users, visitors, right? Whereas, as we know, income statements are all about dollars, right? And they're really different. But, SaaS business models are ones that sort of lend themselves where they're kind of similar, right? Where the dollars and the usage roughly line up. And so hence you can use a lot of these similar product market fit frameworks for both dollars or usage, or really anything else. Really, the way we think about it is it's anywhere where there's value being exchanged between the product and the user, right? Yeah. If the user decides to spend time looking at the product, uploading a photo, or give money, or whatever, there's some value exchange, a unit of value that's exchanging hands, right? It's a transaction. And going back to the ledger example, now you have a ledger of such transactions. Can you turn that ledger, into an income statement, sort of regardless of whether the ledger was counting dollars or not?
So let's look into consumer social a little bit. You guys did, what was the company? Muse? With us as well. When you look at consumer social stuff, some people look at, we talk about monthly active growth, weekly active growth, daily active users. People talk about retention. People talk about the K factor. How might you look at consumer social types companies or what's important?
I mean, all of those things that you just said. I think, we would end up utilizing all of those in sort of the same way. It's not that different, I think. I think, the thing that's maybe novel is more taking the things that you would learn if you stared at consumer social companies a whole bunch and you have all these frameworks for measuring them. And then I drop you into like an insurance company. Now what? Right? And the thing is, a lot of those things actually carry over. The earliest or one of the first big manifestations of this was Slack. It was a great example where it's like, okay, on the one hand, there's a bunch of socially network type metrics you can use. But on the other hand, Slack is like a SaaS company. It has recurring revenue. Yeah. Okay. So like, can you look at it through both lenses and can you sort of arrive at a view on the company, on the product, right, in a way that might be a little bit different than you would arrive at if you only took one of the other two paths. Yeah. And I think that's largely something we look for actually, are situations where like, folks are taking some expertise in one area and applying it in another. Maybe it's a social area, applying it to insurance, or maybe it's like, I have expertise in payments and SaaS. Okay. Like let's mush them together and see what sort of things come out of it. And I think that's where a lot of interesting things happen.
Let's take something like Superhuman. Yeah. Rahul had this line he took from someone else of, hey, product market fit for us is when people would be, strongly upset if we didn't exist. Like that's how we know that we are, totally ingrained in their life. And I don't know if it's a comprehensive definition, but that was one definition or one sort of litmus test for him. Now I'm incubating a product. It's called Cosign. It's sort of I think I may have mentioned it. It's like a peer-to-peer credential network, sort of unbundling LinkedIn endorsements. And for us, we're wondering, is that the right metric? Or because I don't know if LinkedIn was started on that metric in terms of people seem to externally dislike the product yet find it so damn useful. And the things around sort of networks or status, sometimes people aren't as honest either with themselves or with others about how important things are to them if it's utility. And so is for us the metric that they would be strongly upset if it didn't exist, or is it that they use it ever so often? So I'm curious just how often frameworks like the Superhuman, for example, apply to different types of products.
Well, I think, going back to the very beginning, right? Like, when I think about data science and analytics, I think that the initial question is, how do you use it to make the company operate better and build better products, right? Remember the beginning of my career, I spent a lot of time there, right? Yeah. It's like, how do I sit alongside the product team and do this? Now, if you have all the data that Superhuman has, right, and you say, okay, the only metric we're going to stare at is like how many people would be upset, then it's kind of like you have this giant data set that you're just kind of wasting. And also, it's not super obvious to me how a metric like that is useful to help you incrementally. Like if I push an incremental feature, can I measure the incremental difference in this metric? So I don't think the metric's bad, but it's just not so clear that it's useful to me from like a product development point of view and like a regular operating executional point of view. And that's where we tend to focus on, is more like, okay, can we find a metric that's useful for you that you can actually use day in, day out? Can you build teams around it? Can you point teams in that direction and tell them, go do this, go do that, and get them fired up? That's oftentimes more what I think about, right? Totally. If you go back to the accounting example, that's an example where it's really clear, right? It's like, okay, I have many business units. Each business unit runs a P&L. Clearly, I want more P than L. And, and if I measure that and rally the team around it, cool. But then when you deal with things like usage, Superhuman, or some product that has some sort of engagement aspect, I feel like it has to be, it's less obvious, right? Yeah. And then, but you do want something that you can help with, that can actually help with operating decisions, strategic decision making, like I said earlier.
Totally.
Right?
Is it fair to say that we use strategic decision making? Is it fair to say that strategy, Keith Boyd defines strategy in terms of like understanding the equation of a business?
I'm using a weaker definition here. I just mean, maybe what I mean more is product definitions. Yeah. Certainly, like if you want to have like some higher definition of strategy, it may or may not be useful, but.
Totally. What I'm interested in is if we can try to make it what you do, and we understand concrete, and you have a lot of articles on it, but gives some examples for the audience, whether it's like, what would you do if you were at Superhuman in terms of how coming up with that metric, or maybe some examples from your portfolio, past or present. You coming, or what it's like to sort of pick the metric, or.
Well, I think picking a metric is always provisional. Right. So it's important to realize you're never going to get one to rule them all. Right. It's provisional. And I think a lot of the function of the metric you choose is to help orient your next end months, your next roadmap, your next thing. Right. At Facebook, the beginning was like monthly active users, but then that stopped being useful. It turned into like daily active users. And then that stopped being useful. It turned into like time spent and all this other stuff. And then they had all these other metrics. And then remember, like that's a huge company. So each sub team has to have their own thing that they're trying to focus on. And the thing you're focusing on is always provisional. And that's reasonable, right? Because as a business owner, right? Or as somebody who's like trying to run a business or run a product team, the thing you're trying to achieve changes, right? Like you work on this for this next 6 months.
So it became provisional there because they outgrew it, basically?
Well, or you just change your focus, right? And I think that's the answer is that, you change your focus. And then that's not unreasonable, right? Like, it's like you change the thing you're looking at. It doesn't mean that you stop measuring stuff.
Totally. Yeah. And are there specific mistakes that people make when they're picking their main metric or main KPI?
I think, there are a lot of, mistakes. I mean, I think, if you pick a metric that's like too high of a bar where like not enough users can sort of hit the number in some sense, right? You want to be you ideally, right, want to be in a situation where every customer that you interact with, you can get a feel for if you are achieving product market fit with that customer. Right. And so, I don't know, Netflix is like, okay, are they paying you? Yes or no? That's binary. But then there's like, how much time are they spending with you? How many things are they watching? So on and so forth. That's like a non-binary number, right? That sort of has, that's sort of unbounded on one end. And so it lets you really, measure that at some scale, right? Now, if you went into Netflix and you said, okay, I'm going to measure it by a number of people who complain. Well, how many users complain, write into support at Netflix in a given month? It's going to be some low number, right? And if you try to measure the health of overall Netflix by that, it's going to be a little bit, right? It's not going to be a good proxy. But if you run the customer support department, that's obviously the thing you want to measure, right? Funnily enough, a lot of this stuff comes from like macroeconomics, right? If you think about GDP as sort of a reflection of the health of the economy, it has a bunch of problems. And if you sort of read what economists write, there's all these issues with GDP, but it's at least something that we can get around and people approximately understand. And there's approximately a model in economists' heads, at least in terms of what makes it move up or down. It's something to rally around, right? And I think that's like a reasonable, and everybody kind of contributes to it, even though it's not super obvious, how. I think that's a pretty good metric, I think. It's clearly good in the sense that a lot of people have paid attention to it, right? Yeah. Infant mortality, that's a great one. Like how often do, that's a great metric. It's kind of very, very concrete. But then, there are all sorts of varieties out there.
Totally. I'm digging into some of your pieces here a little bit. What are some mistakes or misconceptions that people have when they're accounting for either user growth or revenue growth, or what do they not see or measure incorrectly or not fully appreciate in terms of think about those, or maybe we can, cohort analysis.
Yeah, I think what, oftentimes the mistake, so here's a set of mistakes that we often see is that people spend a lot of time worrying, especially if there's revenue in the equation, they spend a lot of time worrying about revenue, a ton of time. It's like, did I get them to pay me? Are they paying me? Which is reasonable. You're a small company. You want to make sure the cash works out, right? But usually that's only indicative of like one moment of value exchange. If you think about like in a SaaS company, the first value exchange is like, can the salesperson close a sale? And then that turns into money. But then you have all this other value exchange in the future, right? Which is, people using the software. And that's like this constant back and forth it's a value exchange between the product and the user, right? That's happening every single day. And if people spend too much time worrying about the revenue, they don't look right at the other thing here, the engagement. And I think that's the most common thing we see, right? The reality, right, is that early stage entrepreneurs, when they're pitching, and remember, like as investors, we mostly see them, when they're sort of pitching, they invariably try to choose the thing that makes them look best, which is reasonable, right? It's the right thing for them to do. And now the question of whether or not, how that relates to how they operate the company is, could go either way. And then the question of whether or not that's what matters to the investor at hand could go either way, right? So there's sort of like what you focus on to get funded, right? Which is largely going to depend on who you're talking to and what you think gets them excited. And then there's the question of like, what do you focus on to run your operations? That ideally they're the same, but we all know that they're not always the same.
Yeah,
right.
Totally. How about in cohort analyses? Where do people, it's a fairly complex thing. Where do people not understand or not fully appreciate it?
I think the thing that I see the most often that annoys me is that people write down LTV to CAC. Nobody cares about LTV to CAC. Care about payback, right? Because LTV makes some crazy assumption about future retention and churn that likely your cohorts aren't old enough to make that claim with a lot of confidence, right? I think that's one sort of very specific thing. That's the one that sticks out the most. But people, I think, honestly, let's be clear. most early stage companies don't have the time to really do a lot of it, really intense analytics on their cohorts, and they shouldn't, right? They're trying to build their product and satisfy their customers. This should not be the highest priority thing for them, right? And that's part of why, what we do is we help work with companies be like, hey, we can help you to do this in a standardized way. We've computed it 1 million times in 1 million scenarios. We've seen every flavor of the thing, and we can do it very quickly. So that's more, I think that's how I think about that. It's like maybe the flip side of it is like, when does a company decide to invest in starting to learn this stuff? Oftentimes we work with companies, at some point after the Series A and somewhere between the A and the B, where they hire their first kind of like biz ops, data analyst type person. And then that person is kind of tasked with this set of work. And by and large, they kind of, they get it right. Just take some time and effort. This stuff is not rocket science. It's more like diligence to do it, right?
And on the payback, what should entrepreneurs have a better understanding of either how to measure it? You mentioned not LTV to CAC, or how to improve it, or how to think about it.
Well, we think about LTV, let's go back to payback, right? Like there's a bunch of stuff in payback. Obviously, like your levers are, the amount of money you get, and then and then the amount you spent, right? And then the speed at which you sort of get it back. I think, when we think about this stuff, there's just a lot of this question about how the dynamics go between like expansion revenue versus upfront revenue, right? Are you in a situation where you can capture expansion revenue? How are you measuring CAC? Now, this is a tricky one because early stage companies, usually the number of customers is not super high. Right. So your ability to have a really good beat on CAC is just not that great, right? And so there's going to be some guesstimating involved, right? I think one thing that we're always thinking about is like, okay, is this in a situation where CAC is going to go down? Because the reality is most of the time CAC only goes up for a bunch of reasons, right? Like most obviously, like your early users are like, they're early adopters, they're your biggest promoters. But the other thing is there's a bunch of dynamics around acquisition, right? Like if you are buying ads, once you start getting bigger and you try to stuff more money into paid marketing, the system usually jacks up the price somehow, right? Because they're competitors who are roughly bidding for the same users, whether it be, display ads or search. And so that's something we think about a lot is like, are there situations here where you can demonstrate that you actually have a handle on this? Really, maybe at some level, maybe to go up a level. One thing that I think about a lot is like, entrepreneurs who have a very good handle on their company, right? Like versus, there's sort of a situation where the entrepreneur is like, yeah, I can make this number go up if I do this. If I take that employee over there and have them spend half their time on this, I know this number over here will move up by this much percent versus, I could have them spend time on it. I'm not sure what'll happen, right? I don't have full visibility into how the machine works, right? A business or a product, maybe we worry about the business later, but a product is like, it's right. Customers interacting with a product. And if you change the product or if you do something, the pattern changes. Yeah. And part of the question at the early stage is like, do you have a firm grasp on how that equation works? Now, every entrepreneur is going to say they have a firm grasp on that, every single one of them. But, I think part of the thing is that when you see a lot of entrepreneurs, you see the gradations. You see folks who really get it, like who are like, wow, they have a very strong grasp of their business versus the ones who like don't yet have that strong grasp. And honestly, a lot of times the products are too early. The stage of the pattern product market fit is just too early to have a really strong grasp on what's going to happen. Yeah. So I think that's one of those things, like I think about investing a lot in terms of running experiments, right? Like, especially in the seed stage, you put money in, part of it is an experiment. You go in and you say, well, I believe that if I put this money in, this pattern of product market fit is going to change. It's going to grow by this much or something's going to happen. But it's also an experiment. It's like, well, if I put the money in, either it's above here and, my experiment worked, or if it's below here, then my experiment failed and the thing probably doesn't work, right? Every time money goes into these early stages, it has to be thought of at some level as an experiment. Obviously, until you're like this, when you're at a very late stage, now it's just purely to grow, right? But that stage in the middle where it's kind of like an experiment, but you're also kind of growing, that's I think where it's most fun. It's most interesting to us, where it's like, no one thing is dominating. It's just a sort of very complicated, plethora of things interacting with each other.
Yeah. I was talking to Ali Hamed from CoVenture recently, and he was talking about how pre-seed, you need to figure out your customer value as opposed to figure out revenue. And the example he gave was restaurant. They might think it's success if the person, eats and pays. But what's really important is, did the person finish their plate? Did the person take the food home? Does the person come back? And you need to figure out your LTV so you can know how to best acquire customers. If it's a big LTV, you can hire a sales team. If it's smaller, marketing or ad spend. To the extent that you believe that's true, how should entrepreneurs be thinking about figuring out their LTV when they only have a few customers or early on?
Yeah, I mean, like, Honestly, the best thing to do is to treat it like a confidence interval, because realize you don't know, right? You have kind of a lower bound. It's like, this is the worst it could be. Yeah. This is the best it could be up here. And this is kind of the thing in the middle. And that's the reality of it. You don't have enough data to know. And hopefully as time, elapses and as you get more customers, the bands on that confidence interval narrow, right? Like you can bet that at this point, Salesforce knows very, very cleanly what the lifetime value of each customer is going to be because they've done so many of them, right? Yeah. And it's reasonable at the beginning. You don't know fully, so it's a confidence interval. But I mean, like, I'm not saying that everybody should so don't hire confidence intervals, but it's like, it's a good way to think about it, right? Which is that you run experiments to narrow confidence intervals. That's actually what scientists do. What scientists do is they, like if you think about particle physicists or something, they generally have these graphs that are like, here's a graph and here's a confidence band of something percent. And then we're going to spend $1 billion running an experiment and the confidence band will shrink. Yeah. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Yeah. It's like, when you think about payback is like a band. It has a big width around it. And now we give you some money as an investor, a seed investor, a Series A investor or something. And hopefully the band shrinks. The band shrinks enough so that we know that if we shove more money, we know what'll happen. But it's an experiment in that, very tactical sense.
So don't hire a sales team until the founder has done enough sales to know that their confidence interval is,
maybe. I mean, who knows, right? Certainly if you know what's going to happen and you hire the sales team, then you will be in a good position. But, for all this is the thing about it, right? That you don't know what'll happen at some level. For all especially at the early stage when the confidence intervals are super wide, maybe you hire those salespeople and the thing shoots through the roof. Yeah. I was right all along. There's this aspect of both investing, but also running an early stage business, right? You're venturing into the unknown and, you're successful or not. And in the end of the day, is the success due to luck or skill, right? This is sort of the perennial question, right? And there's no clean answer to that, right? Now, that said, each of us should clearly focus on being better at skill because we only do so much for luck. So what is it that we can do to be better at skill? Well, largely, I think one of the things we can do is try to be better at recognizing that these two things interact in a complicated way. And you never know if some result was fully the result of luck only or skill only.
Yeah. I'm curious what separates the entrepreneurs who, to use your example earlier, could say, hey, if I had this person doing, pulling this lever, it would, grow this metric by X% and know it with confidence. And maybe you can give an example of maybe it's at Facebook or maybe it's somewhere else where someone said that and knew it or what that is like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's the confidence of it and there's the actuality of it, I think are two different things. At these big tech companies that have been so good at data, they really do know. They run experiments, right? They run big, ginormous A/B tests. There's hundreds of thousands of versions of the product floating around there and they're testing everything so that they know, with very, very tight accuracy, what to do, what not to do. In the early stages, you don't have that luxury. You shouldn't try to A/B test things when you only have 10 customers. That's dumb, right? It really does come down to your intuition, right? Which is your intuition because presumably you have some subject matter expertise, right? And that's going to come through. And when you talk about sort of like estimating some tactical quantity like payback, CAC, or LTV or something like that, that's going to have to reflect the subject matter expertise of the founder at hand, right? Certainly if the founder has a decade in traditional insurance companies, they're going to know these things, right? And it's going to apply when they start thinking about their insurance technology company, right? So, I mean, I think, I guess maybe from our point of view, we think about it as an investor a lot in terms of developing our own viewpoint. How do we develop our own viewpoint on this? And then how do we have a communication with the founder in terms of here's my viewpoint, what's yours? And how can we have a really healthy back and forth on that, like a dialogue, right? That's the best situation versus a situation where it's like, they're like, oh no, it's X. And we're like, well, I think it's Y. No, it's X. I know. Okay. And now we get into the talent thing. Okay. This could be tricky if we decide to do this long term.
Totally. Totally. And how about on evaluating enterprise companies? I feel like you guys have innovated in terms of like, what are the right metrics that entrepreneurs, there's net churn, there's quick ratio. I mean, there's a bunch of different sort of terms that sometimes founders get lost on where to focus. And obviously enterprise companies or SaaS companies is a huge umbrella, but how would you recommend entrepreneurs think about it, or what mistakes do they make, or what do the best entrepreneurs do in terms of?
I would say the best ones know all of these and they use them all, right? But they don't spend too much time thinking about it, right? It's just a language, right? It's kind of like, they're all useful in their own way, or they all have some history when they were useful, right? And I think if anything, the worst thing maybe the opposite of this. Here's the worst thing you can do. The worst thing you can do is you can dismiss these concepts out of hand. That's something I see oftentimes where like, whether it be an entrepreneur or an investor, they're just like, nope, that number's not useful. I never look at that. Huh, okay. I mean, clearly it was useful to somebody at some time, at least you should understand that. And I think that, having that desire to just know all the things and hopefully they're useful to you. Obviously, you don't want to spend all your time doing that. You have to build your company, but it's worthwhile to know all the things or to try to know all the things, right? And apply them accordingly. When we look at enterprise companies, we know all the metrics and we use them all and in the context of how others have used them. I think a lot of our value is combining them, in ways that, internally that we don't really talk about as much externally, combining them in ways that people haven't done before. And we also have them really well benchmarked at this point, just because we've done them so many times and we're so systematic about it, right? Yeah. If a lot of the analogy here goes back to accounting, right? It's like there's you could read an accounting textbook and it's great. It'll tell you a bunch of stuff, but that's not going to replace looking at 1,000 widget companies. If you look at 1,000 widget companies and you see 1,000 widget company income statements, it's going to, that's going to teach you things that reading the accounting book is not going to teach you. So the articles I wrote are like the accounting book. Cool. But it's something, but clearly it's not going to replace looking at a whole bunch of them.
I mean, it is interesting. I see a lot of founders say, hey, I wonder what my Series A metric should be to raise a strong Series A. And they latch onto this 1 million ARR. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great example, right? Where really the answer there is so the thing is, there is no answer, because if there were an answer, it would mean that all Series A investors are the same, and they're just not. That's ridiculous, right? There's this huge sort of like cornucopia, or maybe this whole there's a huge spectrum of seed investors, a huge spectrum of Series A investors, and a pretty big spectrum of Series B investors. Yeah. They don't really start to normalize until quite a bit later. And I'm sure that if you sat down with the late stage team at Fidelity and the late stage team, at Blackstone or something, or these really big ones, I'm sure they would say they're very different from each other. Also, they would say, there's sort of the saying in investors, right? You believe that everybody who invests before you is like a monkey throwing darts, and everybody after you is a banker, no matter what stage you're in. If you're a series, So, so from the entrepreneur's point of view, like, what metrics do I need to raise a Series A? Well, here's the spectrum, right? And it's useful to know the spectrum. And certainly 1 million seems to be sort of what the system at large has sort of latched onto for no particular good reason. We've done Series A's well before that and well after that. Totally. We think about Series A a lot, or the framing. We frame the rounds a lot more in terms of stage of product market fit rather than revenue, right? There are oftentimes situations you run into where the revenue is way ahead of the product market fit, because the dynamics of the market that they work in just happen to generate large revenue chunks, right? It's like, okay, I got one customer, but they're paying me $10 million. Awesome. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to value you at $100 million post or $100 million pre, and then you're going to take this money and hire all these salespeople. But the reality is that, like, when you hire all those salespeople, you only had one proof point. You had one customer. So, like, how confident can you be about how that sales motion is going to scale out, yada, 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 right? So when we think about, stage, a lot of times it's more a stage of product market fit that you're at, regardless of the revenue number. It could be 0. It could be like huge.
Totally. Can you outline the different stages of product market fit? Or, like, when you say instead of on revenue stages, on product market fit stages, what are some examples?
It's really scale, right? It comes down to scale, because it's a scale. Here's the thing. It's because scale narrows confidence intervals, right? That's why. Because the thing is, when I said that there's a confidence interval around payback, right? Well, what makes the confidence interval go down? Well, N.
Yeah, you have so more scale of customers.
Right. Yeah. Scale of customers, which also means, right, narrower confidence intervals on the parameters you're trying to measure, right? And from an investor's point of view, it's also a restatement is what's sort of the spectrum of outcomes, right? What's the distribution of outcomes here? The distribution gets narrower as all the confidence intervals get narrower as you start to know the thing better, right? So all of those things are, for us, linked together. So it's like, okay, are you at the stage where you have like 5 customers and pretty wide bands, or you have like thousands of customers and the bands are fairly low. So if you like the confidence intervals generally go like 1 over square root of n. So for us, that means, right, it's like having, the difference between 2 and 4 customers, right, is the same as, to get to the next level of specificity, you need to get to, whatever, 8, right? or whatever, right? It has to move up by square, right?
And so I'm curious to think about where you and your firm might invest in a company thinking they have product market fit, where everyone else might think they don't have product market fit, or you think that they have more than other people do. Like, what criteria would lead that to the case?
So generally what we find is that every entrepreneur who raises a Series A, almost by definition, says they have product market fit. Every single one of them. Otherwise, why would they be raising a Series A, right? Every single one of them does. Everybody who invests in Series A, so the thing is that investors generally don't challenge founders on this. It's like, yes, you have product market fit, but I'm passing because of some other thing. So all the investors seem to agree that all those Series A companies had product market fit. And I think this is where our investment philosophy is a little different. We actually don't think they do necessarily. We actually think most of the time they kind of don't. And that's sort of a differentiator, for us. But if you think about like the social dynamics of investing, it's not unreasonable this plays out, right? It's like, yeah, every Series A investor, entrepreneur has to say they have it. And every Series A founder has to just kind of give them their word for it and say, I'm passing for something else,
And so what are the common reasons, or what are some of them that they might think they have it, but they don't? For one example you just gave is, hey, you have one customer and you have a lot of revenue, but that doesn't mean that you've proven it out.
Yeah. It's like, it goes back to that statement about sort of like, how predictable is the machine? Like, is it, I shouldn't say like, obviously like we'd all love super predictable machines, but if we do that, it's very hard to be an early stage investor. So the question is more like, what's the appropriate level, of risk, i.e. what's the appropriate width of confidence intervals that's, given what you're doing and given the valuation that's being discussed and, given where we're at with all the variables considered, I think is really sort of the way we think about it. Are
there other examples of companies that, or patterns that people think that they have are getting this false confidence? Maybe it's their retention isn't great or something. Like their revenue is great, but their retention is other sort of false positives or things that are leading founders to that they should think twice about whether they actually do have product market fit.
Well, I mean, like, like I said, I think that the term product market fit broadly, people use it more as a marketing term, right? It's like, we have product market fit. Give us,
Yeah. I think we have revenue, we have users,
and that's fine. I don't think that's anything wrong with that. They can use it as a marketing term. I think the difference about us is we don't use it like a marketing term. We use it like an accounting term, which maybe is like, that's kind of just the way we view the world. Folks who use the term as a marketing term, they maybe use other terms when they're operating the business, when they're trying to fire up the team, when they're trying to get them to do their thing. And in our mind, that's the thing, right? Yeah. What is it, how is it that you're firing up your team? How is it, what is it? How do you get your team to go, right? Like, is it just mission and vision? Cool. But like, how does that work after 6 months, after a year, right? How do you get them moving towards a goal? What is the goal? And then how do you get from the goal to the mission and to the vision? Like, usually those are connected and there's something in there that's measurable. And we hope that can be the signal. And we hope that can, we hope that we can sort of confirm the story, right? At some level with numbers. Now, I don't want to make it sound like we try to confirm it with extreme precision, because we fully understand that at the early stage, that's not possible. Right. And that's what makes the early stage interesting. In fact, if it were completely solvable with data, it probably wouldn't be very interesting, right? It's only fun and interesting because it's like there's unknown, but some things are not unknown. Specifically, presumably by the time you get to the Series A, you believe you've discovered something about customers that other people don't know. You believe you have a secret, right? As Peter Thiel would say, right? You believe you have a secret, and you're going to try to tell that secret to investors, and maybe they believe you, maybe they don't, right? And every investor is going to treat that differently. For us, we try to see if the secret has some quantitative basis. That's just kind of because we're quantitative people, but we fully admit that like your ability to ascertain this at the very earliest stage is only so good, right?
But if I was to paint sort of a caricature of what happens often, is it founder says, hey, we have all this revenue, we have all these customers, and then you say, hey, but how predictable is that revenue? How much have you proven by how much customers do you, how much have you narrowed the confidence interval?
And I think that's exactly right. And the other side of it, of course, is actually how subsequent investors will think. You can actually think of it this way, because there's a question of the thing you're building, will that have product market fit with future investors, right? The furthest end of that is, how does the public market value companies like this, right? And sort of how are you going to get from here to there? Because invariably the public market or acquirers are going to value these things differently than early stage investors, right? They're going to clearly value them differently. So what's the path, right? Does the path make sense? Does it not make sense? Let's work together on the path, discuss it together, and I think that's a lot of what it is. It's like, when we think about product market fit, right, it's a value exchange. We think of it as like, if you have a robust pattern of product market fit, then you can put different business models on top of it. You see, at the Series A, the business model is usually provisional. It's not finalized, right? In the sense that like, okay, maybe we have SaaS, but like we haven't fully figured out the pricing, exactly how we do the discounts, how are the credits going to work, right? All of that usually gets figured out quite a bit later. But if you have really strong product market fit, then all of that you can figure it out. You will get the opportunity, right? But if the product market fit's weak, then you layer on a business model, unless it's perfect, it'll likely crumble, right? Which is kind of a lot of what we see now. So that's how I think about product market fit and business model, the relationship between them. But when you think about like, when companies get very late stage, when you think about how buyout investors look at them, or the public market sort of looks at companies, right? They treat it more like a business, right? And at the early stage, it's not yet a business, it's a product. It's a product that kind of has a provisional business model attached, right? And so, well, what's going to be the thing that allows you to turn that inkling of a business into an actual business that a growth stage investor can invest in? Well, that's where we believe product market fit is
right.
about.
And are there times where you've invested or wanted to invest in a company, but just didn't see how the either late stage private or public markets would value it appropriately? Or maybe put differently, for a listener who has no context of how, public markets value different types of companies, could you give a little synopsis on?
Well, part of it is just understanding what you want to be, right? Like a lot of times when we look at early stage companies, part of the thing we ask ourselves is how is this thing going to get to $100 million of revenue, right?
And why is that the number?
It's just sort of a round number. Yeah. It's not like a real,
Yeah.
But and the thing is, you have to kind of project into the future and then say, okay, let's say that happens in 7 years, 5 years or something. Let's say you actually achieve that. What do you have? Okay, in 5 or 7 years, if that's succeeded, you have a company that's making $100 million of revenue, has some margin structure, and there are likely comps for that out there. And you should go find out how those comps get valued, right? How do people value them, right? A great example where this is played out a bunch is sort of in wealth management businesses, right? So if you look at sort of publicly traded wealth management businesses, right, they get traded at some like discount to net asset value. Whereas like in early stage world, we value them, I don't know, we value them kind of on like growth, right? And top line growth or something like that. And those two, it's not that that's wrong at the early stage. It's just that those two will have to, at some point, they have to meet each other at some point. And like, how are those dynamics going to play out in the space that you're in, right? This is true a lot in financial services, right? Because a lot of these financial services businesses, right, they have big numbers moving around, but the valuations are sort of commensurately lower, right? And then the flip side of that is sort of in the, what we saw with the social web where they made very little money, but all of a sudden were valued super highly. And it appears that trade seems to have been sensible, given sort of given that those early stage companies were actually able to turn those big, traffic usage numbers into big dollars. But you have to kind of believe that will play out at some level.
Yeah. And so Mike Maple says he thinks the biggest opportunity is in pre-product market fit companies. That's where he thinks the big investment opportunity is. And he's a seed fund accordingly, and not a Series A fund. How do you think about evaluating pre-product market fit?
I think that there are great investment opportunities everywhere. I think there are great pre-product market fit opportunities. I think there are great Series A's, B's, late. I think there can be great opportunities everywhere, right? It is a question of more like you as an investor. This is from the investor lens. As an investor, where do you want to spend your time? Right? Is it only based on the return? Probably not, right? Most of us who do sort of early stage investing of some sort, we don't do it just because we don't do that sector because that's the sector where we think it makes the most money. We do it because that's the sector we're most interested, right? And then we kind of make some story about being the most money because, LPs like that. But, I think that there are great opportunities up and down, right? When you think about the pre-product or pre-product market fit world, right? It just means there's kind of like one variable that's kind of off the table, but it also means you're running these early stage experiments in some sense, right? And you will be the first one to see if it works, which is pretty cool, right? You could be there when it happens. And you just have to be willing to sort of stomach the other side of that, which is that, well, presumably a lot of the time it won't happen, right? And I mean, this other aspect, of course, when you work with a very early stage team is very different. It's like 3 or 4 people. It's different from when they're 15. It's different from when they're 50. Working with the teams is very different. And I think every investor kind of finds the regime in which they feel that is the most, exciting for them.
Where do you stand on sort of the debate of, lean startup versus fat startup? And I don't just mean, amount of money raised, but more so the underlying philosophy of on lean startup. It's this sort of, find out what customers want, iterate, learn, build, measure, learn. And on the other side is perhaps more the Apple, Steve Jobs, or maybe it was Henry Ford, or if I asked what they wanted, I would have given them a faster horse instead of a car. Or, hey, I need to build this incredible experience and then release it. And I guess another debate is sort of, the Reid Hoffman has this quote of, if you aren't embarrassed by your first product, you're releasing it too late or something. Where are you in the debate of sort of, I guess, somewhat as art versus science, but when to release product, how to think about?
I definitely, I go back and forth on this one. I think there are situations, there are definitely situations where, we've passed on entrepreneurs because we didn't think the thing they were doing was like ridiculous enough. It's kind of like, okay, you have some existing market structure, some economic actors doing A, B, and C, some value chain that exists. And then they're like, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create like a software version of it. And then you look at the software version, the software product, it's like, okay, it's useful, but it's kind of incremental. It's just not ambitious enough, right? It's not big enough. So I'm definitely a fan of seeing people try ridiculous things, right? But at the same time, it's like, if you have something that kind of works, right, then at that point you should be trying to expand it, presumably, right? If you think that that's the right path, right? At Tribe, we talk about recognizing and amplifying early stage product market fit. That's where we specialize. And we don't specialize in creating product market fit. We specialize in recognizing it when someone's created it and then amplifying it once we think we agree.
Or you don't specialize in recognizing someone who could potentially create it based on their
and I think this might be and it also might be this thing that we believe we believe it's not. I don't know so much that does the entrepreneur create it or the customers create it? The system creates it, right? Like the entrepreneur puts together some things, and then it's something that happens between the customer and the product, right? Customers don't buy the founder. Yeah. Customers buy the product. Yeah. And I think if we for all that I think we should. We idolize founders. The reality is that at the end of the day, the customer buys the product, right? And you need to build a product the customer wants, whether it be a crazy product that no one's ever thought of, or whether it be incremental, and then do that in a way that makes your business, your company succeed, right? I don't think there's a one solution here for sure. There's many different solutions, and there's not, there's not one way to do this.
Yeah. Okay. So in closing here, we've covered a lot that sort of explains how you, Ted and Arjun, think about venture at Tribe and how you think about company building. What can you leave us with? Some insights or some plugs as to what to expect from Tribe or what to expect from working with you, or what you'd like to see more of?
Yeah, I think, the area that we're going to keep focusing on is that, recognizing and amplifying early stage product market fit. I think from the founder point of view, really, the recognizing it is only useful insofar as we give you the feedback, right? Yeah. Like we give you feedback in terms of, okay, we look at all these companies, we look at them the same way pretty much every time. And when we use that lens on your company, here's what we think. And we hope that's valuable to companies, in the early stage. We've generally found it's valuable. Yeah. We believe it was valuable, from the work we've done in the past. And then the other side of amplifying it is just, it's the same piece of the equation, right? Is like, can we use that to just get to the next level of growth? So the question is who's the best partner for you to grow and to amplify whatever nascent product market that you have? We want to be that. We will continue writing articles about it, but that's really what we want to be there for. We're not here to sharp elbow other investors out of the way. We're not here to do that kind of stuff. We're here to be helpful, and hopefully we can, add some value into the system, through Tribe. That's really the goal that we're trying to do.
Totally. That's a perfect place to wrap. One question I will ask is, do you do a lot of sort of original market analysis, i.e., hey, there's this huge opportunity in insurance, we should find a company? How much of it is bottoms up versus top down?
The bulk of it is bottoms up. Now, the funny thing about this is that I think that it's philosophically, a lot of us at Tribe are actually fairly top-down thinkers. Yeah. Right? Here I am trying to give you a framework for measuring this. Right. It's very top-down. But when we think about opportunities, we really try to keep that aside because it's too easy. I think it's also because of, it's not that's too easy. It's too easy to get sort of, to fall in love with your view of the world. And then the world turns out to not be that. And that's kind of silly. And also I think it's also from our experience sort of operating in startups. It's not the big vision that helps you win or succeed. It's executing, right? It's what happens day in, day out as you and your team are out there winning that customer, building that feature. That's where all the value gets created. It's not from that top-down view. So that's why we focus so much on this operational viewpoint, yet we believe that data has an important thing to say there, which is sort of why we've created this sort of amalgamation of features in some sense that we put together as Tribe.
Yeah, it is interesting. The reason I ask is because of your comment about how the customer doesn't buy the founder; they buy the product, and the market sort of pulls it out to an extent. So it makes sense that you guys think about it. And
one of the things that comes up these days, right? The era that we're in now, right? Technology has made it really easy to build stuff. Yeah. So there's no way that you build something that nobody else can build, right? Yeah. Somebody else will build it, and you winning against them is going to be just it's going to come down usually to a street fight, right? It's you got to win that customer one customer at a time, and all of that just becomes execution. So top down's not going to get you, right. Now that said, we definitely do a bunch of top down thinking and talking, but it doesn't really lead our investments.
Yeah. Do you have any counterintuitive thoughts of how you think about defensibility, or is it it's network effects, it's data moats, how do you guys think about defensibility differently, or what mistakes do companies make when thinking about
I think it's all those things. I think the difference with us is more that for a lot of those concepts, things like network effects, things like moats, we have actually internal ways of measuring those things. We don't publish these, but we have ways of quantifying these things. There are a bunch of things that economists have actually done to try to measure these concepts at some level. And you can kind of use them, But yeah, we have a bunch of ways of quantifying them, which I think is the difference with us. We try to be precise with these concepts as much as possible. It's very, a lot of companies will come and say, we have a network effect for X, but like, you can't do you really all have it? All of you, that's where, we have a bunch of ways of measuring it that really come back once again from those social web days where it became very clear and you really could measure it. And you apply those same analytical frameworks.
And what I love about Tribe is when you meet with the entrepreneur, you will be frank and tell them where you think they have it and where you think they don't, and you give them valuable data in exchange. That's a perfect place to wrap. We love working with Jonathan, Arjun, and Ted and Tribe more broadly, and hope we do more deals together. Jonathan, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erik.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.